In this video, I want to take a second to talk about the difference between connected and disconnected details. Here I have a free model from Polyhaven as an example. This table is comprised of a bunch of different objects. The main body of the table is an object, each of the drawers are an object, and the door to the cabinet part is also its own separate object. Now, whether these parts should all be separate or combined into one single object really depends on what you intend to do with this. If you're just keeping this in Blender and you want to very quickly open and close the drawers, then this is perfect. If you were to export this to a game engine and you didn't want it to move, then you definitely all want it to be one single object. And if this was going into a big animated film, then you'd probably also want to combine it into one single object and use an armature to control the motion instead. But a topic like rigging is definitely for another day. For now, I just want to mention that keeping these as separate objects for use in Blender is perfectly fine. Like we talked about before, you might want to take all of these different pieces and then parent them to the biggest or most obvious one with Control P. And that way, when you move it around, everything else comes with. But the thing that I really want to focus on is that inside each of these objects, we have multiple disconnected meshes. If I hover over the handle and hit L to select everything that's linked to the mesh under the cursor, then it only selects this strip of the handle, and you can see that the square part of the door, as well as the bolts that hold it together, are actually disconnected. In this case, this is a really good thing, because in order to actually connect this handle to the door would require a ton of extra vertices. To actually cut this shape into the big overall face, and then cut all of these vertices into this face, not only does it really quickly become complicated, but then we can't easily move all of the individual pieces. So keeping this as a few disconnected meshes is actually a lot more efficient to work with as well. There used to be this idea in earlier days of computer graphics that every model should be one solid watertight manifold mesh. But the hardware and software restrictions that made that a good idea back then are no longer around, and so it's generally no problem at all to place details directly on top of each other. Let's look at a couple other examples. Here I have a treasure chest that is also by Polyhaven. In this one, they have these pretty intricate ornamental details that surround the trim. If I hit Tab to go into edit mode, you can see that they're also disconnected meshes. This makes these details much easier to create and work with. It also significantly reduces the overall poly count. Another example is this GameCube controller that I modeled a while ago. And this one also uses disconnected geometry for the buttons that crashes right through the main body of the controller. For this A button here on the right, I did actually outline that in the main body of the controller, and that's so that I can make this nice divot right where it meets the button. But I didn't do that for the smaller buttons because, for one, I knew I was going to be viewing this from farther away, and it would take quite a bit of time, but also because making all of those cuts necessary to do that would make it a lot more difficult to get a nice rounded shape on the outside edges. It's possible, but it would have taken me twice as long to model, and using that same time, I was able to detail other parts of the scene that were more important. So I've connected all of the pieces that are obviously one chunk, like the side of the handles and the main flat part of the controller. And that transition was a little tricky, but I think it was super worth it to spend the time to make it look like one solid piece. For the buttons and the joysticks though, the amount of extra geometry that I'd have to add would overcomplicate the rest of the model so much and make it so much more difficult to get a good, smooth result that I just didn't think it was worth it. Now, what you need to combine or not heavily depends on what the target use case is for your model. For example, if it's a video game, then you might want to combine things a bit more. Here's our Orbot model that was modeled by fellow instructor Kent Trammell. Almost all of these details are actually connected, and it results in a lower poly mesh than it would be otherwise. So it makes sense for efficiency, and also he's able to outline details like these knobs and create nice divots around them, which would otherwise be pretty difficult. Now this model might not look like a whole lot in solid view, but if we switch over to material preview, then all of the textures kick in, and you can see that this is actually a really crisp, nice looking model that actually has quite a lot of details to it. Now, when Kent was making this originally, all of these different details were separate objects or separate meshes. For example, all of these screws I can guarantee were separate objects, and some of these buttons and latches were all separate and really high poly at one point in time. But then at the very end of the process, he simplified the mesh and baked it all down to a low-res geometry that can be used in a game engine. So he retained most of the visual detail while still drastically simplifying the actual geometry itself. Now that process is called retopology and baking, and is also a much bigger topic for another day. Just know that if you're working in games, or especially something like 3D printing, there may be times when you do need to combine everything all at the end, But you can also do that at the end of your process. You don't necessarily have to model that way from the start. One last thing to be aware of is that when it comes to animation, disconnected pieces won't always line up when they deform. For example, here we have our Melvin model, which was created by Kent and Wayne, and most everything is one solid mesh except for the eyes and the teeth. When I move the controls for the teeth, then everything follows along quite well, but you can see that it doesn't stick exactly on the mesh. Now in this case, this works out quite well, so I can place the tooth wherever I want, and I can create poses that are kind of cheating, and I can do the same thing with the eyes. But since they're not one single connected mesh, they're not going to follow the geometry of the body exactly. Sometimes this is good, and sometimes it's not. For example, if a character has a detail on them, like let's say there's a little something on his arm there, then if I bend the arm, if that's disconnected, then it's not going to bend and follow along with the arm quite as well. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's not. It's just something to keep in mind. Disconnected pieces will deform differently since they have different geometry. So my advice to beginners is that since modeling is hard enough already, don't overcomplicate it. Go ahead and model your details with whatever workflow is fastest and most convenient for you, and if it doesn't matter, then go ahead and leave it that way. But if you really need to, then you can do a second pass all at the end to combine everything together, but again, only if you really need to.